The grease under his fingernails was the only thing that hadn't changed in 3 years, and that morning, as Marcus Webb knelt in the gravel lot behind Tully's auto salvage with his 8-year-old daughter asleep in the truck because their apartment had no heat, he had no idea that the 10 rusted-out cars rolling off a billionaire's estate truck were about to rewrite his entire life. Before we go further, if you believe in second chances, kindness, and stories where good people finally catch a break, hit that like button, drop a comment, share this with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House. Now, let's get back to Marcus. Marcus Webb was 34 years old, and on paper, he looked like a man the world had given up on. He'd lost his job at the plant 18 months earlier when the whole facility shut down overnight, and since then he'd been scraping together cash doing odd mechanical jobs for whoever would pay him in bills instead of checks. His wife had left 2 years before that, unable to handle the stress, the bills, the slow grinding weight of a life that kept shrinking. What she left behind was their daughter, Harper, a quiet, watchful little girl who had learned far too young not to ask for things. That morning, Marcus had driven to Tully's because old man Tully sometimes let him pick through scrap for parts he could resell. He needed maybe $60 to cover the electric bill before the shut-off notice became a shut-off. Harper was curled in the passenger seat under his old work jacket, her sneakers, the ones with the sole flapping loose, tucked under her like she was trying to hide them even in her sleep. That's when the flatbed pulled in. 10 vehicles, all in terrible shape, dented doors, shattered windshields, one with the entire front end caved in like it had hit a wall at speed. Tully came out wiping his hands on a rag, talking to the driver, and Marcus overheard enough to piece it together. The cars belonged to Eleanor Voss. Everyone in town knew the name. Eleanor Voss was the widow of a man who'd built a logistics empire, and after he passed, she'd taken over and somehow made the company twice as profitable. She lived in a sprawling estate on the hill outside town, the kind of place with iron gates and security cameras disguised as garden statues. The driver explained that these were old company fleet vehicles and a few of her late husband's personal cars, things that had sat in a storage facility for years, damaged in a flood 2 winters back, and she'd finally ordered them hauled off and scrapped because they were, in her words, an eyesore on the books. Tully looked at the cars, looked at the paperwork, and shook his head. "I don't even want these. Crushing them costs more than what I'd get for the scrap metal. Tell her people I'll take them off her hands for free, but that's it." Marcus stood there, and something in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time, flickered. He walked closer, and underneath the water damage and the rust, he saw things. A 1967 Mustang Fastback, its body crumpled but its frame number still visible on the plate riveted near the door. A boxy old Mercedes that, despite a smashed window, still had leather seats that looked original. A row of vehicles that, to anyone else, were garbage, but to a man who had spent 15 years rebuilding engines before the plant ever existed in his life, looked like something else entirely. They looked like history. They looked like value nobody else could see. He asked Tully if he could take them instead. Tully laughed, not cruelly, just surprised, and said if Marcus wanted to drag 10 dead cars onto his property and pay for the tow himself, that was his business, and good riddance to the headache. Marcus didn't have money for tow trucks. So for the next 9 days, he and an old friend named Desmond Cole, who ran a tiny tire shop 2 towns over and owed Marcus more favors than either of them could count, worked every evening hauling those cars one by one onto a borrowed trailer and into the half-collapsed barn behind the rental house Marcus and Harper lived in. The barn became Marcus's second home. Harper, instead of being parked in front of a television, started spending afternoons sitting on an overturned bucket, handing her father wrenches, asking him what each part was called, writing the names down in a notebook because she liked the way the word sounded: carburetor, alternator, timing belt. For the first time in a long while, there was something other than worry filling the hours of their days. The work was brutal. Marcus had no real shop, no lift, no proper tools beyond what he'd managed to keep from his old job. He worked by flashlight some nights, his hands cracking and bleeding in the cold, because daytime hours had to go toward paying jobs that actually brought in grocery money. He sold his own truck's spare tires to buy a basic paint gun. He bartered labor with a parts supplier 2 counties over, fixing the man's delivery van in exchange for access to a database of rare parts. Slowly, painstakingly, across nearly a year, the Mustang began to take shape again. Underneath the rust, the car had been a rare factory configuration, something collectors specifically hunted for, and once Marcus understood that, he knew this single car alone might be worth more than every dollar he'd earned in the last 3 years combined. But knowing something is valuable and being able to prove it to a buyer with money are 2 very different things. Marcus had no name, no shop, no reputation. When he finally finished the Mustang and posted photos online, most people assumed it was a scam or a stolen vehicle dressed up to look legitimate. Weeks passed. The electric bill loomed again. Harper's school shoes fell apart completely, and Marcus wrapped them in duct tape because he couldn't afford new ones, and he watched his daughter walk to the bus stop in shoes held together with tape and felt something inside him crack quietly, the way old wood does before it finally gives way. Then, on an overcast Tuesday afternoon, a car pulled up the gravel drive, a car too clean, too expensive, too out of place for that neighborhood. Eleanor Voss stepped out herself, no driver, no assistant, just a woman in her 60s wearing a plain coat, looking at the barn with an expression Marcus couldn't read. She said she'd seen the online listing. She said she recognized the car. It had been her husband's, the first car he'd ever restored himself, decades ago, before the company, before any of it, back when he was a young man with nothing but ambition and a rusted Mustang in his parents' driveway. She had thought it was gone forever, crushed into scrap with the rest, and somehow it had come back from the dead looking better than she remembered it ever looking. She walked through the barn slowly, running her hand along each of the other 9 vehicles, and Marcus, exhausted, embarrassed by the state of his home, the tape on his daughter's shoes visible by the door, the bare bulb lighting hanging from a wire, braced himself for pity or for her to simply take the cars back, since technically they'd never legally been his to take in the first place. Instead, Eleanor Voss asked him a question that changed everything. She asked him how much he thought all 10 cars, restored to this standard, would be worth on the market. Marcus, with nothing left to lose, told her the truth. The Mustang alone could bring 6 figures to the right collector, and between the Mercedes, 2 vintage trucks, and the others, conservatively, the full set could be worth well over $1 million combined, maybe far more depending on provenance, which she herself could now provide since she just confirmed her husband had owned several of them. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, looking at Harper's notebook full of car part names sitting on a stool, looking at the duct-taped shoes, looking at this man who had taken something she'd thrown away as worthless and turned it, with nothing but his own hands and time, into something extraordinary. She told him she wanted to fund the restoration of the remaining 9 vehicles properly, real tools, a real workspace, real materials, and that she wanted to split the proceeds with him 50-50, because by any honest measure, the value he had created was entirely his own. Over the following months, with real resources behind him for the first time, Marcus finished the restorations to a standard that drew serious collectors from across the country. The full collection, once destined for a scrapyard crusher, eventually sold for just over $10 million. If this story moved something in you, if you believe people deserve a chance to turn nothing into everything, please like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House so more stories like this find their way to you. One more thing before we close: if you've ever felt invisible, like the world had already decided what you were worth, drop the word "seen" in the comments. I read every one, and I want you to know that someone out there sees you too. Marcus bought Harper new shoes that same week, not because he had to anymore, but because he wanted to watch her pick them out herself, take her time, choose the ones she actually loved. He kept the barn, repaired now, not as a monument to hardship, but as the place where it all began, proof that sometimes the things the world throws away are only waiting for someone patient enough, and desperate enough, and hopeful enough, to see what they could still become.